I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all.
12 men have walked on the moon. 12 human beings have stood on that barren gray surface, looked up at Earth hanging alone in the endless black sky, and experienced something the rest of humanity can only imagine. They returned as heroes. They filled auditoriums, wrote best-selling books, visited schools, and appeared before cameras around the world. They spoke about engineering, science, mission objectives, and the triumph of human exploration. Yet beneath every interview seemed to linger an unspoken silence. There was something hidden behind their expressions whenever the questions became too personal. Something in the long pauses before they described what it truly felt like to stand on another world. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. For decades, that silence never seemed important. The official explanation appeared complete. The moon was exactly what everyone expected it to be. A cold, lifeless world covered in gray dust and ancient craters. It was scientifically fascinating, but ultimately barren. The astronauts had seen exactly what the cameras recorded, and nothing more. That was the story accepted by history, taught in classrooms, and repeated generation after generation. Then there was Charles Duke. The 10th human being to walk on the moon, Duke landed with Apollo 16 in April 1972 as the lunar module pilot. Over the course of the mission, he spent more than 20 hours driving the lunar rover across the Descartes Highlands, collecting geological samples, deploying scientific instruments, and carrying out one of NASA's most successful lunar expeditions. At just 36 years old, he embodied everything NASA wanted in an astronaut: a disciplined Air Force test pilot, devoted family man, and meticulous professional whose reputation rested on precision rather than imagination. Mission reports praised the flawless execution of Apollo 16, noting that Duke and Commander John Young achieved every planned objective, while returning some of the most valuable geological samples of the Apollo era. Yet, according to Duke himself, those reports left something out. Whatever happened during those 71 hours on the lunar surface remained unspoken for more than 4 decades. It never appeared in NASA's official documentation, never surfaced during the countless interviews that followed the mission, and never found its way into history books. Even now, well into his late 80s, Duke admits that describing those experiences is still difficult. But in a series of recent interviews, he has begun speaking about what he believes really happened, and what he says bears little resemblance to the familiar Apollo story the public has heard since 1972. According to Charles Duke, the moon is not what we've been told. What he encountered there challenged everything he believed about humanity's place in the universe. This, he insists, is the story he could not tell until now. Long before Apollo, Duke's path seemed almost inevitable. Growing up in South Carolina as the son of a naval officer, he became fascinated with aviation while still a boy, earning his pilot's license before finishing high school. He graduated from the Naval Academy, trained as an Air Force pilot, and eventually became a highly respected test pilot, following the traditional route that produced many of NASA's astronauts. When NASA selected its 5th astronaut group in 1966, Duke quickly established himself as one of its most dependable members, calm under pressure, technically gifted, and known for following procedures with absolute discipline. These were not reckless adventurers searching for mystery. They were engineers and military pilots trained to observe carefully, think logically, and trust evidence over speculation. Before ever setting foot on the moon, Duke had already become part of history. Serving as Capcom during Apollo 11, he was the calm voice from Mission Control speaking directly to Neil Armstrong, and Buzz Aldrin during humanity's first lunar landing. On the radio, he said, Roger, tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again? Thanks a lot. That brief exchange perfectly captured the man behind the microphone, steady, composed, and entirely focused on the mission. 3 years later, it was his turn. Apollo 16 launched on April 16, 1972, carrying Duke alongside Commander John Young and Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly. During 11 days in space, Duke and Young spent 71 hours exploring the lunar surface, more time than any crew before them. Every moment had been carefully scheduled. Their assignment was straightforward: explore the Descartes highlands, collect samples from terrain believed to be volcanic, deploy scientific experiments, and test new equipment designed to deepen humanity's understanding of the Moon. By every measurable standard, the mission succeeded flawlessly. Objectives were completed, samples collected, and experiments performed exactly as planned. Yet anyone who watches the Apollo 16 footage closely may notice something unusual. Several times, Duke simply stops. He stands perfectly still, staring beyond the camera's frame as though something has captured his complete attention. Eventually, John Young's voice breaks the silence. "Charlie, you okay?" After an unusually long pause, Duke answers, Yeah, I'm fine. Just looking." Looking at what? The official transcripts never explain. The mission reports never mention it. And for the next 40 years, neither did Charles Duke. When Apollo 16 returned safely to Earth on April 27, 1972, its crew received the celebration reserved for national heroes. There were ticker-tape parades, visits to the White House, international tours, and hundreds of interviews. Duke enthusiastically described lunar geology, reduced gravity, scientific discoveries, and the unforgettable sight of Earth rising above the gray horizon. But throughout those years, one part of the experience remained carefully hidden. He never spoke publicly about the moments that could not be explained by engineering or geology, the observations that simply did not fit within NASA's scientific narrative. Life moved on. Duke left NASA in 1975, entered the business world, became a popular public speaker, and openly discussed his Christian faith, often describing how seeing Earth from space strengthened his spiritual beliefs. He spoke honestly about his personal struggles, his family, and his life after Apollo. Yet whenever conversations turned toward the Moon itself, he stayed within familiar boundaries. He discussed only what everyone already expected to hear, allowing the official version of events to stand unchallenged for decades. That began to change around 2015. Now, in his 80s, Duke started giving interviews unlike any he had given before. Instead of repeating the familiar Apollo narrative, he began describing experiences he had deliberately avoided discussing for most of his life. One of the first subjects he raised was something he simply described as the light. Not just different, wrong. Sunlight on the Moon should be pure white, maybe slightly yellow. No atmosphere to scatter it. Basic physics. But sometimes, when I looked in certain directions, I'd see colors that shouldn't be there. Blues, purples, not reflections. The light itself was colored, and it would shift. I'd look away and look back, and it would be different. As surprising as that sounded, Duke insisted the strange lighting was only the beginning. He also began describing another experience that, according to conventional physics, should have been impossible. He talked about sounds. You can't hear anything on the Moon. No air, no sound transmission. The silence that, according to Duke, surrounded the Moon was not limited to what he could see. It extended to what he believed he could hear. Decades after Apollo 16, he began describing experiences that, in his view, simply did not belong in the environment he had trained his entire career to understand. We knew that, But I heard things. Not through the radio, not mechanical sounds from the suit. I heard tones, frequencies, sometimes harmonic, sometimes discordant. I asked John if he heard it. He did. We both did, but we didn't report it because it was impossible. For Duke, those unexplained sounds were only part of a much larger experience. He said that the overwhelming feeling was not fear, but the persistent sensation that neither he nor his crewmate were ever truly alone. It was an impression he claimed was impossible to measure, impossible to document, yet impossible to ignore. Every astronaut who walked on the moon will tell you the same thing, if they're honest. You feel observed, not by Houston. That's different. You feel like there's attention on you, presence, awareness, not threatening but enormous, like standing in front of something vast that's paying attention to you. As his recollections continued, Duke described another phenomenon that he believed defied every expectation of a tightly controlled lunar mission. Apollo schedules were planned almost to the second. Every movement, every sample collection, every experiment followed a carefully rehearsed timeline. Yet he claimed his own perception of time repeatedly drifted away from what his instruments recorded. We had strict schedules, every minute accounted for. But there were periods where I'd be working, focused on a task, and suddenly realized that, according to my suit timer, 20 minutes had passed, but it felt like 2 minutes, or the reverse. A task that should take 5 minutes would feel like an hour. John experienced it too. We'd compare notes, and our subjective time didn't match the clock, ever. Whether one accepts these memories or questions them, Duke did not present them as vague impressions or fragmented recollections. He returned to the same descriptions repeatedly, using nearly identical language across multiple interviews over several years. More importantly, he insisted that his experiences were not unique. According to Duke, opportunities for Apollo astronauts to speak candidly with one another about what they encountered were extremely rare. But one such moment came during a private reunion in 2017, when several surviving moonwalkers gathered away from the public eye. Duke later claimed that, for the first time, they openly discussed experiences they had never shared publicly. Everyone had anomalies, Duke said later. Different things for different missions, but nobody's experience matched what NASA told the public. And we all knew we could not talk about it. Not because NASA threatened us, they did not, but because we knew nobody would believe us, or worse, they would think we were crazy. So we kept quiet, all of us. By then, Duke felt he had reached a point in life where silence no longer served any purpose. With his career long behind him and little concern for public opinion, he began speaking more openly than ever before. According to this account, the most dramatic moment came during a 2019 interview when the conversation shifted from strange sensations and unexplained perceptions to something far more concrete. The interviewer asked him directly, "Did you see anything on the moon that NASA has not acknowledged?" Duke replied, "Yes, absolutely, yes." The interviewer followed immediately. "What did you see?" For several moments, Duke remained silent before finally answering. "Structures, not natural formations, not rocks that happen to look geometric. Structures, artificial, old, very old." The interviewer, clearly surprised, pressed for more details. "Where?" Duke answered without hesitation. "In the Highlands. We were on the far side of a ridge, out of direct view from Earth. We had driven the rover about 6 kilometers from the lunar module. We were supposed to be collecting samples from a specific crater, but I saw something on the horizon. Geometric. Too regular to be natural. I called it out to John. He saw it too." The obvious next question followed. "What did you do?" Duke described altering their route within the limits he believed were available to them. We drove closer. It was not on our planned route, but we had some discretion. As we got nearer, we could see it more clearly. It looked like a wall or a foundation, angular, made of blocks, covered in dust, but definitely constructed. Maybe 100 meters long, extending into the lunar surface at both ends, as if we were seeing part of something larger. The interviewer then asked whether Mission Control had been informed. "Did you report it?" Duke answered, "We tried. We called Houston and described what we were seeing." He continued, "There was a long delay. Then we were told to continue with our planned sample collection. No acknowledgement of what we had reported. No request for photos. Nothing. We were experienced enough to understand. They did not want us pursuing it." The interviewer then asked the question many viewers would naturally wonder. "But you took photos anyway," Duke responded immediately. "Of course, we took dozens. Close-ups, context shots, everything. They were all on the film we brought back." The interviewer asked what ultimately became of those photographs. "And what happened to them?" Duke answered, "Those photos were never released. Not to the public, not to the scientific community. I have asked NASA about them multiple times over the years. I am always told they are classified for technical reasons, or they were lost, or they were too poor in quality to release. But I took those photos. They were perfectly clear, and they showed exactly what we saw: artificial structures on the moon." Even that claim, however, was not the point Duke considered most remarkable. The conversation became even more extraordinary when the interviewer asked whether the structures appeared modern or recently formed. Duke replied, "No, that is the thing. They looked ancient, eroded, even though there is no weather on the moon, covered in impact craters, which meant they had been there for a very long time. Millions of years, possibly. They predated anything humans have built. They predated humans." For a moment, neither interviewer nor audience seemed to know how to respond. The implications of that statement hung over the conversation before the interviewer finally asked the question that inevitably followed. "So, who built them?" Duke answered quietly. "I do not know. That is what makes this so difficult. I do not know. But someone, or something, built structures on the moon long before we got there. And NASA knows about it. And they have decided the public should not." As Duke himself expected, those remarks were met with widespread skepticism. Much of the mainstream media chose not to engage with the claims at all, while critics suggested his memories had been altered by age, that he had misunderstood events decades earlier, or that he was simply seeking attention late in life. Yet despite the criticism, Duke never withdrew his statements. If anything, he expanded upon them, gradually describing additional anomalies that he believed had remained absent from every official account of Apollo 16. He described other anomalies. According to Duke, the strange experiences did not end with unusual lights, sounds, or the feeling of being watched. As he became more willing to discuss Apollo 16 in later life, he began describing physical details that, in his view, had never been adequately explained. He recalled areas where the lunar dust appeared to have been disturbed far more recently than natural processes would suggest, faint trails stretching across the surface as though something had once traveled there, and occasional flashes of metallic or glass-like reflections embedded within crater walls that seemed inconsistent with the lunar geology he had been trained to recognize. He also claimed that different parts of the lunar landscape carried distinctly different atmospheres. Although every location appeared visually similar, he said the emotional sensation changed abruptly from one area to another, almost as though invisible boundaries divided the terrain. You'd cross an invisible boundary, and the sense of presence would intensify or disappear completely. Like walking through rooms in a house, each one has a different feeling, even though it's all the same structure. That recurring idea of presence remained central to nearly every account Duke later shared. It was not something he believed could be photographed or measured, but he insisted it was impossible to ignore while standing on the lunar surface. Alongside those impressions, Duke also spoke about unusual radio behavior that, according to him, never received a satisfactory explanation. He recalled brief bursts of transmission appearing on frequencies where no communication should have existed, especially while operating on the far side of the Moon, beyond direct contact with Earth. We would hear bursts of sound, not voices, not mechanical, almost musical. NASA said it was probably reflections from Earth broadcasts, but we were on the far side of the Moon. Nothing from Earth should reach that far. Perhaps the most unusual experiences Duke described involved what he later called moments of complete clarity. They were not visual sightings or audible events, but brief periods during which he believed he understood things that he could neither explain nor remember afterward. According to him, the feeling appeared suddenly, lasted only moments, and disappeared just as quickly. A few times, usually when I was alone, away from John, I would suddenly understand things. Not thoughts in words, just knowledge. About the Moon, about its history, about why we were there. And then it would fade, and I could not hold on to it. But in those moments, I knew. I absolutely knew we were being allowed to be there, that we were guests, that the Moon was not empty and never had been. Claims like these inevitably sound extraordinary. They resemble the language of speculative fiction far more than the technical reports associated with the Apollo program. Yet, the person making them was not an anonymous storyteller or a casual observer. Charles Duke spent decades building a reputation as one of NASA's most disciplined astronauts, an Air Force brigadier general, an accomplished test pilot with thousands of flight hours, and a member of one of the most successful lunar missions ever flown. Throughout his career, he was known for caution, precision, and honesty, rather than sensationalism. That contrast naturally raises the central question surrounding his later interviews. Were these simply memories reshaped by the passage of time? Or was Duke finally speaking openly about experiences he believed had remained hidden for decades? The debate became even more complicated because Duke was not the only Apollo astronaut to make unusual statements after leaving NASA. Over the years, several veterans of the space program expressed ideas that extended far beyond the traditional scientific narrative. Buzz Aldrin publicly discussed the unusual object on Mars's moon Phobos and remarked that people should ask who placed it there. Edgar Mitchell repeatedly argued that governments possessed information about extraterrestrial intelligence. Al Worden, the Apollo 15 command module pilot, openly speculated about humanity's ancient origins. Whether one agrees with those views or not, they came from individuals whose professional achievements were beyond dispute. These were astronauts entrusted with some of the most demanding missions ever attempted, men selected because of their judgment, discipline, and ability to remain calm under extraordinary pressure. As the years passed and their careers drew to a close, many of them became increasingly willing to discuss ideas they had rarely addressed while still representing NASA. According to Duke, the common thread running through those conversations was not that every astronaut witnessed the same event, but that many believed the public version of space exploration omitted important experiences. In his view, what they encountered during their missions often differed from the simplified narrative presented afterward. By 2023, Duke's interviews had become even more direct. During a podcast appearance, he was asked whether he believed there had been an organized effort to conceal information from the public. His response was, "I don't think it's a cover-up in the conspiracy sense. I think it's institutional paralysis. NASA does not know what to do with information that does not fit the scientific paradigm. They have data, photos, measurements, observations from multiple missions that suggest the moon is far stranger than the simple dead rock narrative. But they cannot release it without fundamentally challenging what people believe about our place in the universe. So they sit on it. It's not malicious. It's cowardice. Institutional. The interviewer then asked what Duke believed those unexplained structures actually were. He answered, "I think the moon was inhabited. Not now, at least not obviously, but at some point in the past, something built on the moon. Maybe they built the moon." The word lingered, inhabited. Recognizing how extraordinary that statement sounded, Duke acknowledged the obvious reaction before offering an explanation. "When you have stood there and seen what we saw, the question is not, is this possible? The question is, how do we integrate this reality with what we thought we knew?" When asked why he had decided to speak openly only now, Duke's answer reflected both his age and his perspective. He explained that he had already lived a full life and no longer felt dependent upon NASA's approval or public acceptance. What mattered to him, he said, was leaving behind an honest account of what he believed he had experienced. According to Duke, 12 human beings have walked on the moon, and he believes every one of them encountered experiences suggesting that humanity's understanding of the moon, of space exploration, and of its place in the universe remains incomplete. In his view, uncomfortable truths should still be shared if they expand human knowledge. That naturally returns the discussion to the central question. What, if anything, should be made of these claims? Are they accurate recollections from one of history's greatest explorers, or memories gradually reshaped by 5 decades of reflection? The available evidence is far from straightforward. NASA has never publicly released every photograph taken during Apollo 16, with thousands of images remaining unavailable and officially attributed to technical limitations or quality issues. Duke has repeatedly argued that some of the photographs he considers most significant are among those that have never entered the public archive. Questions have also been raised about portions of Apollo radio communications. Certain sections of the publicly available transcripts are marked as interrupted or affected by technical difficulties, while some astronauts have suggested that conversations continued during at least part of those periods. Former NASA personnel have occasionally hinted that unusual observations from Apollo missions were separated for additional analysis and discussed only internally, though none have publicly provided detailed evidence, often citing security obligations, non-disclosure agreements, or classification restrictions. For Duke, those scattered accounts from former astronauts and NASA personnel added weight to his own memories. He viewed them not as isolated stories, but as fragments of a much larger picture that had never been assembled publicly. To him, the fact that different people, separated by different missions and different decades, described experiences that appeared to overlap was too significant to dismiss outright. At the same time, Duke never argued that conventional lunar science was wrong. He acknowledged that the Apollo samples had transformed humanity's understanding of the moon. The rocks returned by the astronauts have been examined for decades, confirming that the lunar surface is extraordinarily ancient, geologically inactive, and lacking any evidence of a past atmosphere. None of that, he believed, conflicted with what he remembered seeing. Instead, Duke drew a distinction between geology and archaeology. The moon's geology tells us its natural history. What we saw tells us its archaeological history. They are not contradictory. According to Duke, those two ideas could exist side by side. The moon's natural formation might be well understood, while its history as a place visited, or even inhabited, could remain almost entirely unknown. Whether that interpretation is correct remains deeply controversial, but it forms the foundation of the story he has chosen to tell. Supporters of Duke's account often point to what they see as recurring patterns across multiple Apollo missions. They note similarities in descriptions of unusual light, an unexplained sense of presence, distortions in the perception of time, and reports of geometric formations. Critics argue that such similarities may simply reflect the psychological effects of operating in one of the most extreme environments humans have ever experienced. Either way, the overlap between these stories has become one of the most discussed aspects of Duke's later interviews. That distinction leads to perhaps the most important question of all. The issue is not necessarily whether Charles Duke believes what he is saying. By every indication, he does. The real question is whether those memories accurately represent events that occurred on the lunar surface, or whether decades of reflection, combined with the extraordinary conditions of spaceflight, reshaped those experiences into something very different from what actually happened. Duke has repeatedly acknowledged that possibility and insists he has spent years asking himself the same question. He has revisited his memories countless times, searching for inconsistencies or reasons to doubt them. Yet he says he always reaches the same conclusion, not because he trusts his memory alone, but because he believes his crewmate witnessed the same events. According to Duke, John Young observed the same anomalies at the same time, and the two discussed them while they were still on the moon. He has also argued that elements of their experience resemble accounts shared by astronauts from other Apollo missions. Whether one finds that